All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September 2024 UCLA Tarjan Center Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Jasper Estabio, Director of Training for the Tarjan Center, and it's my pleasure to be here with you for our very first lecture of the 2024 to 2025 series. A couple reminders before we get started. For translation services, you may click on the Show Captions option on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Click on the upward caret and select My Speaking Language, where there will be options for a number of different languages for you to choose from. For closed captioning, you may click on the stream text link that will be sent in the chat, and that will provide a live part closed captioning. Please also enter your questions for our speaker into the Q&A throughout the talk, and we'll facilitate discussion at the end of the presentation. You will also be able to complete our evaluation survey to provide feedback and suggestions for future lectures. The link to the evaluation survey will be sent in the chat today, as well as in a follow-up email this week. Lastly, after today's lecture from 1 to 1:15, we'll have our very first UCLA Tarjan Center Research and Resource Exchange. This is an optional opportunity for our attendees to learn about research studies and community resources from our faculty. Dr. Rijita Wilson, who is the Director of Research for the Tarjan Center, will be sharing a few research opportunities, and our audience will be able to ask questions and learn how to get involved. All right, and then with that, I will introduce our speaker for today. Go ahead and join us, Dr. Warner. All right. Dr. Blake Warner, whose pronouns are he, him, is a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Program for Education Enrichment of Relational Skills, or the PEERS Clinic, and the Tarjan Center. He received his PhD with a dual specialization in clinical and disaster psychology from the University of South Dakota, where he was a two-time leadership education and neurodevelopmental and related disabilities, or LEN trainee. Dr. Warner's research and clinical interests center on disability-related policy and advocacy training, as well as interventions focused on the intersections of gender, sexuality, and neurodiversity. I've also had the pleasure of working with Dr. Warner since he came to UCLA as a pre-doctoral psychology intern last year, and we are very fortunate that he is continuing his training as a postdoctoral fellow here. He is a fantastic clinician, researcher, and advocate for individuals with disabilities, and we look forward to an illustrious career ahead. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speaker, Dr. Blake Warner, who will be presenting on UCEDD, Policy, Advocacy, and the Developmental Disabilities Network. All right, I'll hand things over to Dr. Warner.
Thank you, Dr. Estabio. What a wonderful introduction. I don't think I've ever heard the word illustrious used in the same sentence as my name. So I appreciate that wonderful introduction, as well as kind of the introduction to my talk here today. When I was first approached about giving the first Tarjan Distinguished Lecture Series, I really thought about all of the things that were going on in my bio and some of the experiences that I've had in my career so far. And a lot of the things that were mentioned in my bio had a lot of letters in them. And so I thought it would be a good idea to maybe do some demystifying of some of the alphabet soup that comes in with government and academic and clinical work. And so we're going to talk today about UCEDDs. As many of us might know, the UCLA Tarjan Center is a UCEDD, but who knows what that means? Some of us might have some experience with what a UCEDD is and other organizations that are related. But I thought we could start by kind of demystifying those and related organizations. And then I also wanted to touch on policy and advocacy, especially related to developmental disabilities and the Developmental Disabilities Network. So we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the learning objectives for today. And I think, it kind of has two components. We're going to do a double crash course today. The first, as I said, is kind of, straining out some of that vegetable soup of acronyms. And so we're going to hopefully focus on understanding the role of UCEDDs and other developmental disabilities, or DD network partners. And then in the second half, or that second crash course that we're going to go through today, I really identify some strategies for disability policy and advocacy. A lot of people hear the word advocacy or think about policy and look at it as kind of an intimidating sort of factor or an intimidating project. A lot of people want to get involved but don't really know how. So we're going to talk about how we can maybe get involved a bit more with policy and advocacy. All right, so starting off with our alphabet soup, the first acronym I'm going to talk about today is the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, and this is AUCD. And just as kind of a preface to the next couple of slides here, some of us might have varying degrees of understanding of these different organizations, and I'm really giving a 10,000-foot overview here. So I encourage everyone, if they're interested in these different organizations or how to get involved with some of these things, to dig in a little bit more on your own. We could be sitting here all day, and I would love to do that and provide information on these different organizations and how to get involved. But we only have an hour, and I want to get through a lot of content, so we'll be pretty brief here. But when we think of AUCD, I like to think of it as kind of this large, almost meta organization. So the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, or AUCD, has three kind of main components or main partnerships with different organizations and different types of organizations that are throughout the United States and territories. So we're going to cover each of those individually. And I put examples actually from UCLA because UCLA is kind of unique in that it's one of very few centers throughout the United States that has each one of these organizations in place. So the first one is a UCEDD, so we're all here to learn about UCEDDs, but we also have the other two components that AUCD houses, which is the LEND program, and I'll demystify those acronyms as well as the IDDRC, or Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center. Each of these different organizations that fall under the purview of AUCD has varying roles and various foci that they really target in on and focus on. But a lot of the roles of these organizations are interloped and really dig into each other. A lot of these organizations go hand in hand, and you'll see that somewhat when we talk about their functions here. And they also have different funding sources. So although they're all housed under this larger AUCD, or Association of University Centers, they do have different functions and they're funded by different sources. I will also provide a kind of handout of all the different organizations that we're going through today. So don't feel like there's a quiz or anything, or that you have to memorize all of these different letters, because there will be a lot. But AUCD is kind of the first one. And I want to dig into LEND first. And so we're going to talk about what a LEND program is. LEND stands for Leadership, Education, and Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. What LEND is it's 60 programs. There are 60 of them throughout the United States. Not every state is guaranteed to have a LEND program. However, most states do. There are 44 states and territories that have LEND programs. And I'm just going to use California as an example because I know a lot of our audience is from California, but this is applicable to other places as well. But in California, we actually have 4 LEND programs. I think that might be the record. We might have the most out of any state, but we have our UC LEND program, which is a collaboration between UCLA and UC Riverside. We also have the CHLA LEND program. UC Davis has a LEND, and UC San Diego and SDSU also share a LEND program as well. So there's 4 programs in California. LEND is funded through the Autism Cares Act. If you're paying close attention to legislation, Autism Cares Act is up for reauthorization this year. I have to double check where we are in that process. But I know that these LEND education and neurodevelopmental and related disabilities programs are funded by the Autism Cares Act and administered through the Maternal Child Health Bureau, the MCHB. So even more letters for you there. But the role of a LEND program is really focused on interdisciplinary training. If we had to boil it down to a couple words, those are the words I would choose: interdisciplinary training. And really, this interdisciplinary training is what it sounds like. So it's training of researchers, community leaders, clinicians, graduate students, individuals with disabilities, and family members. And everyone in a LEND program, all these trainees are training together in order to provide the best care and outcomes for individuals with disabilities and their families. I'm a former LEND trainee, if you remember from my bio. So in South Dakota, I had a chance to participate a couple of times in the LEND program, and a lot of my knowledge and skills related to disabilities and providing services, as well as leadership opportunities, have come through the LEND program. So just kind of an overshot of what that includes. So it includes research components. So people in LEND programs, these LEND trainees, are conducting research or participating in research activities. They're also participating in leadership activities. So that includes things like didactics or learning, as part of a cohort. And they also provide clinical services or shadow clinical services. So there's kind of these three pillars in LEND that trainees are able to really lean on in order to gain experience and be better providers for the future. The second component, so that's the first arm of AUCD is LEND here. The second part of AUCD is our IDDRCs. These are Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Centers. There are 15 IDDRCs in the United States. 2 of them are in California, so we house one here at UCLA. There's also an IDDRC at UC Davis. So those are our 2 IDDRC programs in California. The funding comes from a little bit of a different source than the LEND programs. The funding of an IDDRC actually comes from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. So a different funding source, but they are kind of focused on similar areas. So as the name suggests, of course, the main focus of an IDDRC is research components. So although there are training opportunities for trainees to participate in research opportunities through an IDDRC, the main focus is on research, especially into the causes of intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of various interventions that we might look into as far as intellectual and developmental disabilities. So these are kind of research hubs. There's a lot of different researchers who work at IDDRCs, and there's a lot of collaboration that happens there as well. And as I mentioned, most trainees who might go through an IDDRC might be a postdoctoral fellow doing research, or an undergraduate researcher. There's lots of opportunities to get involved. And we have one here at UCLA. So if you want to get involved with them, I encourage you to reach out to our IDDRC as well. And then finally, so the last kind of the big 3 programs housed under that Association for University Centers on Disabilities, or AUCD, is our UCEDD, and the University Centers of Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And there are 68 programs, so 68 UCEDDs across the United States. And these are a little bit different than LEND or IDDRC in that every state and every territory in the United States has at least one UCEDD. So this is state dependent. Every state is mandated to have a UCEDD. And there are 68 across the country. We have 3 here in California. So once again, we have one at UCLA. There's one at UC Davis, as well as USC Children's Hospital of Los Angeles as well has a UCEDD. The funding source for these the UCEDDs here that we're talking about, these are funded or authorized under the Developmental Disabilities Act. So many of you might be familiar with that act, but that act authorized the UCEDD programs, and it's administered by the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, or AIDD. The difference here between LEND and IDDRCs is that UCEDDs have 4 core functions, and I'm going to get into those in just a moment. But really the overall role of a UCEDD, such as the Tarjan Center. So we're all here today with a similar purpose of learning about UCEDDs. But their overall role is to respond to state and local needs of people with disabilities through a lot of the different areas that LENDs and IDDRCs also cover. So through research, service, and education. And they work to transform policies and systems as well. And the way that kind of works is that UCEDDs are also a member of what we call the Developmental Disabilities Network, or the DD network. And I'll touch on what that means in a little bit as well. So hopefully everyone's keeping up here with all of our alphabet soup. But I want to dig in specifically a little bit more to what a UCEDD is and how we can really engage with our UCEDDs and get the most out of them. So here at the Tarjan Center, it's a UCEDD. And so as I mentioned, all UCEDDs have these core functions. So the 4 core functions of a UCEDD are research and evaluation, information dissemination, interdisciplinary training, and community service. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of overlap with all of these different programs, but these 4 core functions happen in every UCEDD. Now, it's going to look different in every UCEDD, and that's because UCEDDs are formed. We have directors such as Dr. Lageson and Dr. Estebillo who gave my introduction here today. So we have people directing, but really a UCEDD is run by an advisory committee or an advisory council. And these advisory councils are made up of professionals, people working in the field of developmental disabilities, people with lived experience or family members with disabilities. And really the role of these advisory councils are to shape the missions and values of a UCEDD to make sure that the services we're providing, the research we're conducting, all of these different areas that meet these core functions here are guided by individuals with disabilities. There's this very common saying in the disability community of nothing about us without us. And I think that really applies for advisory councils. So many of you in the audience are probably already members or are familiar with our Tarjan Advisory Committee, or our TAC as we call it. And this is really the guiding force of our UCEDD. We also have subcommittees for each of these core function areas. But just to give kind of an overview of what the functions are, so research and evaluation. We conduct research sometimes in conjunction with LEND programs or IDDRCs, but also conducting independent research through a UCEDD. And we add to the latest findings and policies. So we're not just hoarding our research. One of the other important aspects of a UCEDD is to actually disseminate or to provide useful information about our research and other community programs and services that might be offered. And we disseminate that information out to the public, and especially targeting the disability services sector. So people who need services can often get connected to those through our UCEDD. We also provide interdisciplinary training. And so this is similar to a LEND program where training is provided to individuals across disciplines. So we're all here today for a lecture series. This is part of our training, right? We're providing a service of training for the public and for professionals, as well as individuals with disabilities and family members as well. So that's part of that interdisciplinary training. And then community service, like I mentioned, a UCEDD really is there to function community facing. So we want to understand and communicate the needs of the community, as well as provide training and technical assistance to different programs in a community to make sure that the needs of the community are being met. All right, so those are the core functions. Like I mentioned, each of those core functions happens at each UCEDD, but it might look a little bit different depending on the needs of the community. Okay, so we're going to move into the Developmental Disabilities Network now. As I mentioned earlier, UCEDDs are part of the Developmental Disabilities Network. However, there's kind of a three-pronged approach, or three parts that go into the DD network. UCEDDs are the first one, so we already kind of talked about how they provide interdisciplinary or pre-service preparation, community services and training, as well as research evaluation and disseminating of all of those types of research. As I mentioned, there's one or more UCEDD in every state. So that's the first part. The other two parts we're going to cover briefly here, and then I'll provide examples of what that looks like in California, although it is applicable to every state. When the DD Act came out, the other two things that were provided within that act were that every state will have a Developmental Disabilities Council. And the role of these DD councils, or the Developmental Disabilities Council, is to really understand system barriers and to change them through initiatives. So there's a lot of advocacy involved with a DD council. And then also working with stakeholders to achieve this enduring change and empowering advocates. So similar to a TAC, a DD council, or our advisory council here in our UCEDD, the DD council is also made up of members from UCEDDs, these protection and advocacy agencies that I'll talk about next, as well as community members, people with lived experience, and family members as well. And so these councils really do try to understand barriers and make a strategic plan for the state to go forward with related to developmental disabilities. So in California, our Developmental Disabilities Council is called the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, so SCDD. I'll talk about that next. But I also want to touch on this third prong. So along with our UCEDDs and our Developmental Disabilities Council, each state also has a protection and advocacy organization. And really, this is kind of the legal prong of the three organizations here. The protection and advocacy, as the name suggests, focuses on protection and advocacy for individuals with disabilities and their families. So they do things like monitor and investigate conditions in facilities that care for people with disabilities, provide legal representation to people with disabilities. So if our needs aren't being met, or maybe we're encountering difficulties with accessing services that are legally required, this is where protection and advocacy agencies can come in to help make sure that those legal representations are being met. And then they also ensure equal access to life in the community. And so in California, the Protection and Advocacy Agency is called Disability Rights California. And so they're going to be named something different in every state, but every state and US territory has at least one of each of these three members of their Developmental Disabilities Network. So as I mentioned, in California, our DD Council is called the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, or the SCDD. Our SCDD, or our state council, has 31 members who are appointed by the governor, and they include individuals with disabilities, family members, as well as federally funded partners and state agencies. So UCEDDs are often have their directors as members of this state council, for instance. One of the roles of the SCDD is to provide a 5-year state plan related to disability rights and advocacy, as well as create a yearly work plan and a yearly report to the federal government on how things are going related to developmental disabilities in California. So that's just the SCDD in a brief nutshell. We could spend all day talking about each of these organizations if we could. The other organization, so our protection and advocacy organization, is Disability Rights California, or DRC. There are 24 offices of the DRC in California with over 340 staff. So they're kind of everywhere. You can look around and see where your local office might be. And the role of the DRC, among many other things, is to protect and advocate for the rights of people with disabilities, as I mentioned, and really look through advocacy through legislative action. So the DRC is a little bit more intertwined with our legislative session and providing advocacy in a professional setting. They also provide legal aid services. For some situations, I don't want to, tell everyone to go and get their legal services through the DRC, but definitely check into their website to see what services they might provide. And then they also provide training and outreach related to advocacy, laws and disability, and other topics as well. I should also mention that each of these organizations I talked about will be on my list of resources. So you'll be able to find links to all of these websites on my list of resources. Okay, now I'm going to shift into the second portion of today. So as you might have noticed, throughout each of the organizations I talked about, one of the roles in various aspects that these organizations provide is advocacy, or training for people who want to be advocates. And I want to touch on how we can be advocates. Now, I like to think of advocacy in kind of 3 different components. There's 3 things that we might be able to provide, and they all happen to start with T in some regard. And so one of the things that we might be able to provide is our time. So maybe we don't have a lot of money, maybe we're not exactly sure what talents we can provide, but maybe we have a lot of time to give. So if we're trying to meet with legislators, if we're trying to enact change, make things happen, we know that legislators have a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it. So if we're really interested in a certain topic area, or we're trying to advocate for legislators who might have our back and provide resources and laws that benefit individuals with disabilities and their families, we can do things like campaigning and mobilizing. Legislators would love if you could campaign for them. That's if you can donate your time in that way, spread their message. That's one way we can advocate, is to just spend or give our time. The other one that I won't touch too much on today is treasure. So if you happen to have the funds to provide, it costs a lot of money to run for any political office. And so spending money, kind of putting your money where your mouth is, and being able to donate to people who are trying to be elected and have our interests in mind can be a way to advocate as well. So treasure. And the one I'm going to focus on today is talent. So as many of us are healthcare professionals or family members, or maybe people with lived experience, or who provide services for individuals with disabilities, we know a lot of things that legislators do not. There's no way that a legislator can know everything that they need to in order to make informed decisions on legislation. And so one of the things that we can provide as professionals, or any of those other groups I mentioned, is our talent. And really the biggest role of any advocate is to educate legislators on the topic of our expertise, whether that be clinical expertise we have or our own lived experience. And we might have other talents to share as well. All right, but if we're going to advocate, it's important to think about the difference between personal and professional advocacy. It can be really intimidating to think, oh, I am going to go meet with my legislator. That's kind of a scary thing that maybe many of us don't choose to do. It can seem kind of intimidating, but it's important to think about it in a way of personal versus professional. So if we are going to advocate and specifically meeting with legislators, we might need to do so in a personal way. So if we're spending our own time and our own money to meet with a legislator, absolutely okay to do that, right? We need to speak from our own experiences if we're going to do that. So you can speak on your own opinions using your own email and your own phone, as well as your own time. So for instance, if I go to Washington, D.C. for a conference, and I travel to that conference on federal funds, so I'm funded through a federal grant or by an organization, I really can't be meeting with legislators during that time and talking about my own opinions or my own email or using my work email or my work phone or being there on my work time. I need to and make sure I'm not referencing my employer, because once we start using the word we, then suddenly it seems like we're speaking on behalf of an organization. And unless we have permission from that organization, we really have to speak from our own opinions, our own experience as well. On the other hand, we might be able to engage in professional advocacy. There's a few ways we can do this. I'm going to touch briefly on lobbying here. Lobbying is really asking for specific bills and laws, and so we want a specific thing. We have a specific ask. And this is often done by registered and paid lobbyists, and they typically represent organizations or interests. So there are people who are paid to lobby for various organizations such as AUCD, and any organization you can think of tends to have a lobbyist who speaks on their behalf for legislation that they would like to have done that can benefit their members. If we are speaking on behalf of an organization or under federal funds, what our role often is to educate about what we know. Instead of lobbying for a specific bill, we might educate on our own experience or talk about our own experience or bring our own facts and figures that we know about. So I know there's a lot of autism researchers in the room, for example, and if you're an autism researcher, you might not be able to advocate for a specific bill, but what you can do is provide those facts and figures and maybe some personal examples of your own experience with autism. But in general, we want to make sure we're not asking for specific laws or specific bills to go through. And I also want to preface that I am not a lawyer. I don't have a legal background. However, I think it's important to think about these differences and also acknowledge that each state has different legal requirements for lobbying. So please take everything with a grain of salt and do your own research before deciding to engage in advocacy or meeting with a legislator. Okay, if we are going to meet with a legislator, it's important to think of the 5 W's, and I think most of us know these questions that can help guide us. So who, what, where, when, and then there's the honorary how W, which has a W in the end, so we're gonna count it here. But if we're thinking about communicating with legislators, it's probably a good idea to know who our legislators are. And don't feel bad if you're not quite sure about that. I think that's true for a lot of us. Maybe we vote in the election and then over the years, we maybe forget who our elected officials are. But if we are going to advocate or educate our legislators, it's important to know who these people are. So I recommend looking it up. And I have links in my handout as well that will provide for California lookup as well as federal representatives. But each state should have a lookup as well to find your regional or your state representatives as well as your federal representatives. It's also kind of important to think about the staff. So oftentimes what happens is we try and go and meet with the legislator, but we know that they have a lot of meetings and a lot of other duties that they have to attend to. So more often than not, we get to meet with their staff. And building relationships with the legislator's staff is a great way to continue communication and be able to extend the advocacy beyond the meeting. But in general, know who your legislators are, because legislators don't typically meet with people outside of their district. And so when we're able to provide information about where we live, legislators much more likely to actually meet with us because they want our vote in coming elections. And so they're more likely to meet with us if they know we're a constituent or a voter in their district. All right, so now that we know who our legislators are, we can move on to the what. So this is what we talk about. What we don't just go meet to meet. We have to have some sort of game plan. And this is the what. So we want to know the message we want to give. So what's the outcome we're looking for? Do we want to educate on a specific topic, or just kind of share our experiences, or put ourselves out there as a resource for a legislator? All great ideas, by the way. But it's a good idea to know what our message is. If we want to get involved in advocacy and we're not exactly sure how, I recommend using resources from organizations you're a part of. So AUCD, for instance, has resources on meeting with legislators and legislative priorities. You can look at other organizations you might be a part of. So I'm a psychologist by training, so I'm a member of APA, or American Psychological Association. They have policy priorities as well. So you can really think about reaching out to those organizations if you want to get involved, but you're not exactly sure what to be involved about. In general, also, we can look for specific bills and follow both state and federal bills as they're going through to know what we can advocate for a little bit more, and keep an eye on things. And just as a hint, these websites tend to end in .gov if you're going to look up bills on state and federal advocacy, or bills that are going through. I also have links to our state and federal websites that we can look up different pieces of legislation as they're going through the process. All right, our third W here is where. So there's a lot of different locations where we might meet with a legislator. If we're meeting with our state legislature, we might meet at our state capitol, which is Sacramento here in California. If we're meeting with our federal legislators, we might meet in Washington, D.C. That's where they tend to be. We might meet virtually, since COVID. There's, obviously a lot of bad components of COVID, but one thing that came out of it was a lot of virtual things like we're doing right now, as well as the ability to potentially meet with legislature or their staff virtually. A lot of states have community events where legislators will come to meet the community one-on-one, so we might be able to go and advocate at those events. And then there's a lot of local offices. So each representative has a local office. So look into your representatives and maybe check out where their local offices are if you want to try to set up some meetings. All right, our next W here is when. So timing is very important in advocacy. It's one of those Goldilocks sort of phenomena where there's the idea where maybe we're going too soon. So if I know that I have a passion about a certain topic, I might go and advocate for it or educate about it. But if it's not quite on their radar, if there's not legislation coming up about it yet, it might be too soon, and they might kind of forget about us, forget about the things we're asking for or educating about if it's too soon. On the other hand, it might be too late. Kind of redundant here, but if it's too late, it's too late. So if someone's voting or if there's a piece of legislation being voted on in the next week or maybe the next day, it might be too late to go and share our expertise or share our experience. Legislators might have already kind of come up with their plan, their game plan for voting. So it's kind of a middle ground. I don't have an exact answer for when this might be. And so I recommend just kind of continuing dialogue or continuing to meet with legislators and build relationships and establish ourselves as a resource for them. All right, so finally getting to the how. So there's a lot of different aspects of how we can advocate. We can advocate in person, virtually, via email, or phone call. I think though these phone calls are kind of scary for people, and anyone younger than me, I would say, might be a little bit afraid of a phone call. But it's a good way to get in touch with legislators. Emails might get pushed aside a little more than phone calls, but I really recommend using your time effectively. Legislators are often meeting with us for maybe 2 minutes to 20 minutes at most. And so we really have to make sure we're using that time efficiently. And so one of the most efficient ways that we can use our time if we're meeting with legislators is to really tell our story. And I'm going to have a shameless plug here for a program that we've conducted here at the Tarjan Center. So we have the UC Leadership Academy for Emerging Disability Rights Leaders. And this was a program that we ran in conjunction with all of those federal partners that I talked about in the first half of my presentation here today. So we all got together and really built this program for emerging disability rights leaders. So individuals with disabilities who wanted to go above and beyond and to learn how to advocate effectively and to be able to talk with legislators in a more effective way. And so one of the ways we did this is through our Tell Your Story model, which I'll talk about in just a second. But in general, our program was a 10-week virtual program. And it teaches advocacy skills, especially related to telling our story. That's kind of our capstone in the program so far. And we're hoping to recruit again later, but I can maybe touch on that in the Q&A if people have some more questions about this program. But I want to touch on the Tell Your Story model because I think this works in a lot of different for a lot of different people and for a lot of different reasons. The way that this came about, by the way, I'm going to go back a slide here. And when we think of telling our story, so TEL, it really comes from research from about 3,000 years ago. So Aristotle had modes of persuasion, so things that go into almost every persuasive message. And those were ethos, pathos, and logos, if you're familiar. And we found that when we kind of translated these words into English, they fell into the letters of TEL. So trustworthiness is ethos, pathos is emotion, and then logos is logic. So they all work out well to tell your story. And we know that effective storytelling has these three components, especially if we're trying to have a persuasive message. So the first thing we want to do if we're going to tell our story is the T. So this establishes our trustworthiness or kind of our credibility. And really what we're doing to establish this credibility is describing who we are. So if I'm a professional in the field, I'm going to mention that. I'm going to talk about my experiences, maybe my qualifications, and really asking myself the question, why am I an expert in this? Those of us who might not think we're experts, you are an expert. Just by being here, we know you have an interest in developmental disabilities, which means you're either a provider for individuals with disabilities, maybe you're a family member of someone with disabilities, maybe you're disabled yourself, or maybe a combination of all of those. And so we're all experts in our own experience. So we can, introduce ourselves and speak from our own experiences, as well as establish our trustworthiness through our qualifications as well. So that's the first component that we want to include in our story. The next component we want to include is emotion. And I like to think of this as stories versus numbers. So I tend to, and I don't know if this is true for all of you, but think about this. If I'm watching a movie, I'm more likely to remember a movie than I am to remember, numbers and problems that happened in math class. And this is often because stories are involved in movies. I think this is a good picture to kind of represent this as well. So without storytelling, things are maybe a little jumbled up. And then once we have the storytelling, it kind of solidifies that memory. And so we want to include stories and really emotion into our how we're telling our story. And this is really talking about our experiences. Legislators want to hear about our experiences, and tying a story to those experiences can really help them to learn and to be educated about various topics through more than just numbers, right? They want some emotion, some story built in there. So the questions we can ask ourselves if we're using emotion in our story is, why does this matter to me? Why is this topic important to me? And what is my story? So I encourage everyone who's thinking about meeting with a legislator to really think about what your story is, what's bringing you or calling you to want to speak with a legislator. And then kind of briefly, the third component, or the L of telling your story, is logic. So I mentioned that stories are really important, but we also need to have the logic to back up our story. And this is really research. Maybe we're researchers and we conduct research. This is a great time to bring those facts and figures to legislators or their staff. And the questions we can ask ourselves here are, who does this impact? So beyond just me, how many people is this impacting? Is this a big problem? If it is, then maybe something needs to happen. And do I have facts to support my opinion? If we go in with opinions, our legislators might listen to those things, but we also need to have some facts to back it up, to support those claims. And that really helps to solidify our story and really tie everything into a nice bow. So we want to include all three components of trustworthiness, emotion, and logic in telling our story. A few important reminders here as far as telling our story is to keep it short. As I mentioned, legislators might have 2 minutes to talk with us. They might have 20 minutes. And so it's important that we can prepare these stories, the things we want to talk to legislators about, into neat packages and be ready to provide a 2-minute talk or a 5-minute talk or a 10-minute talk. And it's also important to note that advocacy is about relationships. So we might think of this as a sort of one and done type of situation. I'm just going to advocate one time. But what happens often is we can provide our resources and our information, and it's a lot more efficient to build a relationship and become a resource for a legislator and their staff. Because if they, have questions related to autism or disabilities and we have expertise, then what can happen is they'll reach out to us if we can provide information to them, which is a lot more efficient than us, keeping tabs of every law that's going through or coming down the line, and having to advocate each time. If we're a resource, the staff can come to us for questions. And then I think another important point here is strength in numbers. Advocacy is most effective when we share a message with others. And so if we can come up with a unified force, maybe people who have similar experiences, and everyone goes and shares those experiences together, it's going to sound like we have a bigger crowd of people versus me just going and talking about my one experience. It's going to seem like this is mattering to a lot of people. And so a good way to do this is to get involved with organizations who maybe already have an advocacy plan and see about sharing your stories with those organizations so they can include that as they're advocating for laws and changes with legislators. I don't want to leave everyone here without any sort of next steps. So here's some kind of takeaways in general for what I would recommend to do to get started with advocacy and maybe our learning journey. So from the first part of the talk today, I recommend working with AUCD. As I remember, that's Association of University Centers on Developmental Disabilities. So work with those AUCD members. So that's our UCEDDs, our LEND programs, and our IDDRCs. And work with the DD network partners. So if you're in California, you can work with the UCEDD that's in your area. So if you're around UCLA, please reach out to the Tarjan Center. And also reach out to Disability Rights California if you want to get involved with their initiatives and their programs, and our state council as well. So reach out to those programs. We want everyone to be involved. I also recommend looking up and contacting your legislators. And if you're not quite ready to contact your legislator, at least look them up. It's good that we're aware of who our legislators are and who's representing us. But it's part of our duty as informed citizens. Share your time, treasure, and talents. So we have all three of those in various degrees. Do what you can. If you don't have a lot of money, you might not be able to share your treasure, but maybe you can donate some of your time to help with advocacy, or you can tell your story and share your talents in that way. Speaking of, tell your story. I encourage everyone, even if you don't plan on using your story or going forward to actually advocate with legislators, I encourage everyone to think about their story, think about your trustworthiness. What establishes you as a credible individual? Do you have lived experience? Do you have credentials and expertise in the field? Do you have family members with disabilities? And then think about your own story, that emotion. How can I tell my story? What matters to me and why does that matter? And then logic. Well, how can I back up all of those things? So create your story, try it out, give it the 2-minute shot and try that out there. And then another important note here is that it is a voting year, right? It is an election year. There's a lot of important local, state, and federal elections happening. So get out and vote. And the last link that I shared on my resources is a link to help you register to vote. If you're not sure how to do that, voting is the most basic form of advocacy that we can have. We want to make sure that we're represented by people who will work for us and have our interests in mind. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about registering to vote or already voting. I won't tell you who to vote for, but be informed if you do. All right, those are my takeaways here. And I'll just kind of open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Warner, for that informative and very timely presentation. Another reminder for our audience to please continue submitting your questions for Dr. Warner into our Q&A. I see a couple in there, so we'll be addressing those in just a minute. And maybe Dr. Warner, while we are waiting for those questions to accumulate, I think I'd like to start with just kind of quick overview, thanking you for reminding us that there's nothing about us without us in the disability community, really encouraging people to get involved. I also thank you for helping us navigate this alphabet soup of all these different acronyms and organizations, institutions. I do think that it can be quite confusing, but they all are very important in working together and have different roles in participating in advocacy, advocacy and practice, education and research. So it's important for us to know who to go to for all these different pieces of information. Um, Maybe Dr. Warner, if you could start by just going over some of the resources that you have on that resource page and reminding us what is on there. While he is pulling that up to our audience, the recording for today's lecture, as well as the slides and the resource handout will be available on the Tarjan Center website in just a couple weeks. You will be emailed with all those resources once the recording is available. So yes, that will be available to all of our attendees. All right, so we have this on the screen. Dr. Warner, if you'd like to just give us an overview on all of these and how they might relate to today's talk.
Yes, absolutely. So as I said, I don't expect anyone to remember all of the alphabet soup. So I thought I would strain it out here and put links to each of these organizations on this handout. So you can have that. I also just wanted to point out that I included the contact for the Tarjan Center. Hopefully you all have that since you're here at a Tarjan Center presentation. But if you do have any questions related to these resources or anything that I've talked about today, please reach out to this email and I'm happy to get in touch with some answers. But as we're kind of navigating this, I want to first point out that I have an organizations section here. So these are all of the organizations that are under AUCD, or that Association of University Centers on Developmental Disabilities. So I first linked to the AUCD website. So if you're not sure where to start with any of these materials, I would say start here. They have information on all of these different organizations and how you can get involved with the larger AUCD network as well. And then I also included links to the AUCD website specifically on the 3 different programs. So we talked about leadership, education, and neurodevelopmental and related disabilities. So that's the LEND program. And you can learn about what LEND is here at this link. IDDRC, so that's our Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Centers. You can learn more about IDDRCs here at this link. And then finally, UCEDDs, the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. You can learn more here. And there's actually a YouTube video that's linked that also explains the difference between the different programs. So if you have a few minutes, I would recommend checking out that video. It's available at any of these links as well. So you can learn more about those programs and how to get involved. I also included links to our developmental disabilities or DD network partners. I didn't include links to every UCEDD, so if you want to get involved with a UCEDD that's in your area, you can certainly check that out. But I did link to our website, so our Tarjan Center UCEDD here, as well as the websites of the other 2 members of the DD network, which is our State Council on Developmental Disabilities here, and our Disability Rights California here, which is the Protection and Advocacy Agency. Couple other links that I think are really important that if you're not so if you don't care too much about the different organizations but just want to get involved, you can look at your legislator here for your California state representative as well as your federal representative. So your House of Representatives nationally, you can use this link. And then if you just want to look up your California state representative, use this one. If you're interested in looking at different parts of legislation or different laws that might be coming up, both in California and nationally, I included links to legislative information in California as well as federal or national legislation. And then in bold here as our last link, I included a registration link to help you register to vote in California.
Great. Thank you so much for Dr. Warner for compiling all those resources. Very, very helpful. And just a reminder for our audience that you can get involved and share your talent or expertise. I think a lot of us might feel a little squirmy about sharing our expertise, but we are experts in our own lived experience, regardless of where that comes from. Use your voice. It's very important to do so. One of the questions here, Dr. Warner, is more about kind of just how all of these organizations work together and how they fit together under these larger umbrellas. But how does the Department of Developmental Services and regional centers play a role in UCEDDs, which, reminder for our audience, stands for University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and the AAIDD, which is the American Association for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So how does the DDS and regional centers kind of interplay or play a role in our UCEDDs and the AAIDD?
Yeah, so one thing I will just say in general is that if you look at the boards of these organizations and the individuals who tend to be members of these organizations, there's a lot of overlap. And so you will find people who are members of regional centers who are on our Tarjan Advisory Committee, for example, making sure that we are having the best interests of regional center members or clients involved in our Tarjan Advisory Committee, and I know the advisory committees of the other UCEDDs as well. So I think that's a big component of how there's engagement, within different organizations and how this overlap happens. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on is maybe less about regional centers, but those three sort of AUCD organizations, and they're often housed in similar locations, and members of an IDDRC might also be housed under a UCEDD or part of a LEND program. So there's a lot of overlap between the agencies and between these organizations as well. So I don't know if I completely answered that question, but I will also point you to the resources and to reach out to these organizations to answer some of those more specific agency-specific questions as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think just reaching out and everyone in this field, I feel is very helpful. So even if we're not the right people, we more than likely know who to direct you to if we are not that person in charge of that role. So just reach out. If you have any questions, you can also reach out to the Tarjan Center at our email address, which is Tarjan Center, TARJAN, center at mednet.ucla.edu. It's a great place to start. And we have a big team where we can direct all of our audience to resources that it might be relevant. Blake, is there I had a question here about about LEND training programs. Since you're a two-time LEND trainee, do you know if LEND provides training on research and findings to other agencies like law enforcement, or what is kind of the role of LEND in their training programs?
Yeah, so just like UCEDDs are all different, each LEND program is actually a little bit different and has those core functions. So every LEND program is going to have the interdisciplinary training. They're going to have educational services. They're going to have research components, and they will also have clinical components. Related to, a question related to law enforcement in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I would recommend reaching out to your LEND or your UCEDD to see what's happening. Part of the research that happens in LEND programs is really dependent on what a trainee is interested in. So if you happen to be a LEND trainee or you apply and get a LEND fellowship as part of the LEND program, whichever LEND program that might be, one of the things you might be able to do is to really go for your own research interests. And so it's very possible if you're interested in dealing with law enforcement and other types of things related to disabilities, that you could provide that research and that outreach, actually. One other thing, I won't dig too much into NEARS. Some of us have maybe heard of NEARS, but there is a national reporting system so that all of the LEND and UCEDD programs throughout the country are able to talk about the different areas that are being researched. So if you are interested in a specific topic related to disabilities and research that's happening, you could reach out to our UCEDD and we could maybe help connect you with someone who's doing that research somewhere in the country.
Excellent. Like, are there any conferences or events that you would recommend to people who really are inspired and want to get more involved with the DD network? Are there things like affiliated with AUCD or other UCEDDs where people could just attend and get more involved?
Yeah, so I'll save the Tarjan forum for you to talk about in a minute here. But as far as AUCD, so in every November, the first week in November, the annual AUCD conference happens in Washington, D.C. And it's a great time to go and meet with other people in the disability services sector. So there's providers there, but it's really a trainee-focused event. So a lot of LEND trainees are there, but also a lot of individuals with lived experience and their family members are there as well. So it's a great time to kind of connect. We often do Hill visits at that event as well. So it's a great conference to attend. I always have a lot of fun when I go to the AUCD conference. But really, if you're interested more in the advocacy piece, I would recommend going to the Disability Policy Seminar. And maybe we could provide some information on that, but that happens every March, April. And it's a chance to go and learn about the issues that the disability community faces. And so we learn from professionals, and then we also learn how to advocate. So they give us some topics and priorities to advocate for. And then we get to meet with legislators. If that's something you're interested in, they can help set up those appointments if you attend the Disability Policy Seminar.
I think that's a great resource, people who really want to advocate. I believe also for those of us who are in California, the California State Council on Developmental Disabilities, or SCDD, that Dr. Warner mentioned, does have open meetings that people can attend. So that might be a great way to, dip your toe in the water, see what is being discussed, what issues are top of mind, and really just start to get involved. I think it's an excellent place for people to get some resources and information.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Speaking of the upcoming Tarjan Center Annual Forum, I'm happy to share a little bit of more information because I know that Dr. Warner will also be involved. But to our audience, that is coming up in about 6 weeks on Friday, October 25th from 9 to 5:30. We will have our second annual UCLA Tarjan Center Annual Forum in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities with various presentations from our faculty as well as individuals with lived experience. We have discussants who share their reflections on the topics and a moderated discussion. So we have a wide range of topics related to neurodevelopmental disabilities. And I'm sure you'll learn more information about our UCEDD and how to get involved. And maybe before we transition and wrap things up, but Dr. Warner, do you have any other kind of lasting recommendations if people were going to, commit to one action item and they were interested in getting involved? What would be a place to start and a way to learn about, different bills and things that might be of interest to our audience and emerging disability rights leaders?
Yeah, so first of all, vote. So get registered to vote. Get informed about who your options are to vote for. I think that's a great way to do it. And look at their voting history. So if they're already involved in legislature, you can look at one of those links I sent and really pay attention to their voting history. Are they voting for the things I want them to vote for? And if yes, then that's a great person to vote for. So I would say vote, and also check out the AUCD website. I think that's a great kind of hub to look at other ways to get involved and also learn more about the different organizations that there are out there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Warner, for such an excellent talk and giving us a great overview on all these different acronyms, ourselves included. And thank you for starting us off on this wonderful lecture for the 2024 to 2025 lecture series. Reminder to our audience to please complete the evaluation for our lecture so that way we can continue providing topics on things that are pertinent to you. I'm happy to get your feedback and to learn about what interests you. Another plug for our upcoming annual forum, which will be on October 25th. So mark your calendars if you haven't already. And then for our very first Tarjan Center Research and Resource Exchange, that will be right now from 1 to 1:15 today. It is optional for our attendees to stay, and you'll have the opportunity to learn about research opportunities and community-based resources straight from our own faculty. So if you are unable to stay, you're welcome to pop off. But for those who would like to learn a little bit more about research opportunities and resources, please stay on. Another round of applause virtual for Dr. Warner and this excellent presentation. Thanks so much, Dr. Warner. It was such a pleasure having you present today.
Thank you, Dr. Estevio. I'm excited to stick around and learn about some of the research happening at our UCEDD.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Warner. And with that, very timely, we have our wonderful presenter, Dr. Rujita Wilson, who is our Director of Research for the UCLA Tarjan Center. She's also a child neurologist by training and professor here at UCLA. I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Wilson as she shares about some exciting research opportunities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Estevio. So first of all, for those of you who can stay on, thank you for taking the time. And I do have some slides, but I'll start out by saying that the goal of this is really to be able to make our research studies and other resources as accessible as we can make them. And our first start, kind of kicking off this very exciting research and resource exchange program, is to have each of our faculty members, particularly those engaged in research studies, share a little bit about what research studies are available under maybe the ones they're doing or others within the Tarjan Center, ways to get connected, and then really answer any questions we can about the studies we're talking about, or more broadly, or if we can't answer the question, to know the right people to connect any of you with. So please feel free to type any questions into the Q&A, or I don't think we have the raise hands, or within the chat, and I will keep a lookout and answer, and I'll start chatting a little bit. So first, let me go ahead and share my screen. And so again, as Dr. Estebillo mentioned, and I mentioned here, we're calling this a research and resource exchange. They'll be happening after each one of our lectures for about 10 to 15 minutes after the talk is given, in hopes really, because you guys are already here, we appreciate your time, and perhaps you'll have a little bit more time to be able to stay on and hear more about some of our resources. What I've started out with on this first slide, and actually I saw it in the Q&A as a request, is the first link that I've put up there is a link to our Tarjan Center. And there you'll find many different resources that are being posted by our team, including Beth Stoffmacher and others. And there's also a link about research studies, and you'll see a link there, and my email will be on here to connect with me if you have questions. And so from that link, you can access some of the names of our faculty, the research studies that they're doing, some of the opportunities there, or reach out to me if you have any questions and you'd like me to put you in touch with anybody. The second link that I've put there, which is a program we work very closely with, is our Center of Autism Research and Treatment. And I put it there because there's an entire research program under that center, and a link there that I have of many different research studies that are available. And I'll start by saying that there are a tremendous amount of research study opportunities here at UCLA, either through faculty in the Tarjan Center, the Center of Autism Research and Treatment, or many other sort of researchers, many of whom are affiliated with the Tarjan Center, that are doing research and work in the realm of with individuals and community programs serving those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And these research studies range from what we call longitudinal studies, where we're monitoring people over time, to cross-sectional studies, a one-point-in-time research study, to intervention studies, where the studies are delivering interventions either here at UCLA or in the home. Which brings me sort of to the other point, which is there are studies that require people to come here to UCLA, and there are actually more and more studies that are being opened up where they can be accessed remotely, understanding and recognizing that there can be barriers to trying to to come to UCLA, either for the individual or for the family. So I think that's just an important aspect to keep in touch as we hold our research subcommittee meetings. We hear a lot about that in terms of, do I have to come to UCLA? Can the researchers come to me? And know that there are studies that are doing both of those. The other thing, in each study individually, we can always connect and share about and give the information. Some studies are available in other language, some others aren't. But I think that's also important to know that there are many studies that are available, in, for example, in Spanish, for those who are Spanish speaking. And again, I can help you with that or be a conduit to help connect you to the right people. So today in our time, I'm going to focus actually a little bit more on my research program here, because I'm the first faculty speaking to you today, and I'm speaking to you sort of in two hats, as director of research to talk more broadly, and as a researcher myself and a faculty member and a clinician. So I'll introduce you a little bit to my program very briefly, and then I'm going to focus on two specific research studies right now that are recruiting. And then again, as I said, I'm very happy to take questions throughout and also leave some time at the end or just general conversation. Let me get this. So here's a lot of pictures, my program in pictures. And because again, my goal was really to talk and ask questions if needed. So as Dr. Estebillo mentioned, I am a pediatric neurologist, and I'm a pediatric neurologist trained in neurodevelopmental disabilities. That was my fellowship or subspecialty training. I am a clinician, so I take care of patients, both in the child and adult neurodevelopmental clinic and our genetics clinic program, our caring program. And I see patients both in the clinic, and then I do spend some time in the hospital working with our residents and fellows, training them as well and seeing patients there. I'm also a clinical researcher. So as a part of my research, I see a lot of children through adolescence that come into my research lab here at UCLA or at home where we do assessments and we study different aspects of development. One of the main focus of my research lab is motor development or motor function. And maybe more specifically, atypical motor development or motor challenges or impairments or delays in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This spans from autism to intellectual disability and to those with these conditions that both have genetic diagnoses and don't have genetic diagnoses. So you'll hear a little bit about that in the next research study that I'm talking about. We also focus on using different methods to measure motor abilities. So what I mean by that is that we use more direct standardized assessments where we come in and ask a child to do certain tasks like fine motor activities and gross motor activities. But we also use methods where we call them more objective, for example, where we use wearables. You kind of see this baby here in the top corner wearing those. We also use those in toddlers. We use things like gait mats where individuals walk across it and we're able to pick up really fine aspects of locomotion or gross motor. And we use these different methods because for us, it makes our data collection more accessible to individuals with a range of intellectual abilities, a range of behavioral challenges or strengths that some of our standardized assessments have a little harder time doing, right? If you don't understand a task or you can't do it in a certain amount of time, you may score very low on a measure, but that's not actually representative of what you are or not able to do. So that's why our lab also focuses on some of these methods. So you'll see everything from the standardized assessment of putting coins in a box all the way to monitoring gait based on a mat and using some of these wearables. Another aspect that my lab focuses on, and these aren't the studies I'll be talking about today, but I'm happy to come back again and talk more about them, is we partner with community programs delivering things like organized physical activity, like tennis or dance programming. And we measure these programs to understand what are the benefits for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, with the goal to build the evidence for these programs, accessibility for these programs, and data for clinicians so that they can refer children to these programs. The ones that you see down here is we work with Acing Autism quite a bit. It's a nonprofit organization in the community. And then the other picture that you see here is a program that we started called the Expressive Movement Initiative that I started here with a student. And this Expressive Movement Initiative, and I'll mention the link in a little bit. I forgot to put the link here, is an available dance program across all quarters during the year, not during the summer. And then that anyone 4 to 17 years of age with an intellectual and developmental disability can join. And then we have a separate research program for kids 8 to 12 years of age. I see a little chat, so I'm gonna just take a look real quick before I go to these studies. Oh, that's Dr. Estebillo. Okay. So now I'm gonna stop for a second and move on to the 2 studies I'm gonna talk about. And again, any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in. So the first study that I want to talk about is one of the ongoing studies in my research program right now. This study is called the Chromatinopathies in Autism, Motor Phenotyping and Indicators of Neurodevelopment, or the CHAMPION study, we call. I can't take credit for coming up with that acronym. Our wonderful research associate on the study came up with it, but I think it's a pretty great one. So what I'm going to focus on here is kind of one group of kids that we are really focusing on recruitment right now for. The age range for this study is 1 to 5 years of age. So almost all the way up until the day before your 6th birthday, an individual can be enrolled. And right now we're really focused on enrolling children in this age range with an autism diagnosis and no known genetic condition. Now, a small caveat here I'll say, because I know there's both providers on here, maybe community members, caregivers, individuals. If there is a situation where somebody is highly suspicious or concerned for autism and a formal diagnosis hasn't been made yet, I would still encourage you to reach out if you're interested in the study, and we can talk through a little bit more about what that might mean and in terms of eligibility to be in the study. As a part of this study, the location is at UCLA. It requires one visit to UCLA. And if there is some support needed for transportation to UCLA, that is available, and we can talk about that as well. And then it requires one visit in the home. So that's remote, done over Zoom, where we do some motor testing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. As a part of the visit, we do a very comprehensive developmental assessment. We do an autism assessment, we do a developmental level or cognitive ability assessment, a neurological examination, and then we have motor assessments. And one of those is what I talked to you about, is wearing those sort of wearables that look like Apple Watches to gather how a child moves in their home across the day, not worn at night, just during the daytime. We also do parent interviews and questionnaires around adaptive function, autism symptoms, medical background, and on language. And as a part of the study, you'll get written feedback about the child's development across these assessments, $100 in compensation, and verbal feedback from myself or my colleague, Dr. Nicole McDonald. And here I've provided a QR code you can scan, a website link to this study, and then contact information if you're interested in the study as well. What I'll note here is that there have been families who've come to us who've maybe had some time or difficulty, despite the autism diagnosis, getting more full developmental assessments. And we essentially are doing assessments that are done in a clinical setting for comprehensive assessment. And we can send this to your clinician. If you have a developmental pediatrician or a pediatrician, we can send those assessments to them so they can review them as well if it helps with diagnosis, or help set you up in a clinic appointment here at UCLA if there is of interest in that. So that's the first study. Give a second if people would like to write down some of this information, and I'll highlight the second study and then take a few minutes for questions. The second study is a study of which I'm a co-investigator on, but it is being headed, the primary investigator is Dr. Connie Cassery, who's a very well-known researcher and clinician here at UCLA, who created something called the JASPER program, intervention program. And this study is called the PEDAL study, promoting early intervention, timing, and attention to language. This study is specifically recruiting infants who have an older sibling with autism because they're considered at increased likelihood for autism. There have been a lot of studies that have been done, and both myself and Dr. Cassery are part of a consortium called the Baby Siblings Research Consortium, or the BSRC, which is a community resource you can also get. And I'll put that actually in the chat here as we're talking, because that's another link we can follow up with. And they have a lot of community-based resources there. The study is recruiting infants between 6 to 8 months of age. And as you can see there, it's an intervention study. So the infant's actually enrolled in intervention, primarily supporting language, because we also know there's higher levels of delayed language in infants who have an older sibling with autism. If you are interested in the study, that's the contact information I put both in the flyer and bolded. And in this study, it's all done remotely. So the interventionist, the team, the assessments are done in the home, and it does not require a visit to UCLA. Going back to our study, what I just want to note also at the Champion study is we do have Spanish-speaking assessments for those who are Spanish-speaking families or participants who are interested. So I'm going to stop there, recognizing we just have a couple of minutes, and I'm very, very happy to answer questions, just chat more broadly, or make any other comments that might be helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for presenting on Champion and PEDAL. For any of our audience who have questions, please feel free to submit them into the Q&A. I know that this is very helpful for me as a clinician to get some resources for families and to share other research studies that they might be eligible for. But any questions from our audience about research or the studies that Dr. Wilson had presented? You see here, I have something in the chat. That's Dr. Wilson's email address is available also. Great. Okay. So maybe, Dr. Wilson, we can just direct our audience to that QR code and some of the websites and links that you had shared.
Yep. That sounds great. So please, thank you so much for your time. And also thank you. Oh, I do see one question. Is there any research being done on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders? That's a really good question, actually. And there was previously a study. I'm not aware if it still is ongoing. And so what I'll do is I'll get back. Actually, somebody else had asked me a question on the clinical side about this. And so not one particularly from one of our Tarjan faculty that I'm aware of, but we were just doing some digging on this to see if there's anyone across Semmel Institute that we're continuing these studies. And hopefully, as soon as I get that information, what I'll do is I'll send it out so that it can be disseminated if that is the case. So thank you very much for that question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I'm trying to think myself, Dr. Wilson, if I can think of any other studies. But for Annette, that question came from Annette. We will do a little bit of research on our own, and we will follow up and disseminate that to our community if we find any.
Yep, sorry, Dr. SB. I'll just note it's Dr. Mary O'Connor at UCLA, who is our primary fetal alcohol spectrum disorders individual. So again, follow back up. That's a name for you all just to have also to look up, but I can follow back up with any specific research studies that might be available.
Yes, and Dr. O'Connor did present a distinguished lecture last academic year. So to our audience, if you want more information on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, you can go to our website and go to the drop-down menu on the lectures from last year, and you can watch her excellent talk. Let's see here. Oh, we have another question here, Dr. Wilson, on any research studies for adults or genetic studies on neurodevelopmental disabilities. And if they're open to collaborating with researchers outside of the US.
Yeah. So on adults, there are research studies that Dr. Kathy Lord is undertaking on adults. So so again, Dr. Kathy Lord or Catherine Lord, which you can see on the website itself. There are also research on the adult realm, kind of depending on what sort of the avenue that's being looked for within this. These aren't research studies, but they're sort of support studies that you can look through the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health, or AIRP. There are also studies, if you look at that website, that are enrolling adults as well. The second question, anyone working on genetic studies on neurodevelopmental, and I'm sorry, another one is Dr. Lauren Clark in our Tarjan group as well that you can look up, that is doing more research studies that are inclusive of adults as well with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For the second question, Naeem, thank you for that question. I actually work quite a bit, and so could have highlighted that one big arm of the Champion study, and many other studies I do are genetic studies on neurodevelopmental disabilities. I'd be very happy to connect to hear a little bit more about collaborators and researchers outside of the US. We speak quite a bit to researchers outside of the US who are engaged in these type of research studies. Other geneticists are Dr. Dan Geschwin, who heads our UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment. He is more of a basic scientist that does genetic studies as well. And I'm pretty certain he has international collaborations and would love to hear more about that too. So please feel free to reach out to that directly to me. I do the clinical arm of those studies across many what we call genetic neurodevelopmental disabilities.
I think another resource for a research study that is currently enrolling adults is the Peers for Careers program and Peers for Dating. They're both currently in their RCTs or randomized control trials, recruiting currently. So you can reach out to the Peers Clinic, which is Peers Clinic at mednet.ucla.edu for information on any of those Peers research studies too.
Thank you, Dr.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for presenting for our very first Tarjan Center Research and Resource Exchange. All of these information will be disseminated to our community and to our audience. Thank you so much for attending our first lecture series of the academic year. We look forward to seeing you at the annual forum, which again is Friday, October 25th. And then we'll be picking up with our lecture series again on Monday, November 18th. So we'll see you in a couple months. But enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Stay cool if you're out here in California in this heat wave. We look forward to seeing you at all of our upcoming events this year. All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much.